La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. That is the Muslim creed, and it means there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, or as I said last time, Allah just means God. The creed is one of the five pillars of Islam. If you want to convert to Islam, all you have to do is recite the creed and mean it, of course, in your heart. And this makes you a Muslim. There are other things you need to do afterwards, but that is how one converts to Islam. The five pillars of Islam, and I have a link on the class website to a place that explains them in more detail. The five pillars of Islam include the creed, number one. The second pillar is prayer. Prayer is something that faithful Muslims do 5 times daily, facing Mecca, specifically the Kaaba, the sanctuary of Allah in Mecca. And this prayer is supposed to take place at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, just after sunset, and in the evening. The third of the 5 pillars of Islam is almsgiving, or zakah it's called. Traditionally, 2.5% of one's wealth above a certain minimum is expected to be given for use by the poor, in support of the poor. A fourth pillar of Islam is fasting during the month of Ramadan. The month of Ramadan, I should say the Muslim calendar is a purely lunar calendar, which means that it goes on lunar months, and the lunar year is only something like 354 days as opposed to 365. So every solar year that most of the world follows, the Muslim calendar kind of marches backwards. And so Ramadan, some years will take place in the summer, sometimes in the winter, fall, spring. It just kind of moves back 11 days every year from the previous year. So the fourth pillar of Islam is fasting during the month of Ramadan. And it's fasting during the daylight hours. They can eat at night, but during the daylight hours, they fast for that month. And then the Ramadan ends and is celebrated with a big feast called Eid al-Fitr. And it's the feast begins when some official person sights the first sliver of the new moon. That means that the month of Ramadan has ended. The fifth and final of these pillars of Islam is pilgrimage, or Hajj, H-A-J-J. Pilgrimage to Mecca once in a lifetime, if possible. All Muslims are encouraged to travel to Mecca if they can. Another important concept, in addition to these 5 pillars, was the concept of jihad. Jihad means struggle, but traditionally it meant inner struggle. That is, a struggle to overcome your selfishness, your greed, your anger, things like that. But some took jihad to mean holy war, and it is taken that way by a fairly small minority of Muslims in the world today. What are some of the other beliefs of Islam? Well, they believe that God, Allah, is one, and He has no partner. You can see that already in the creed that we talked about a minute ago. He is Allah, one. Allah, the everlasting refuge. He has not begotten, nor has He been begotten, and equal to Him is none. This is the saying from the Quran. There are traditionally 99 names for God, including the merciful, the compassionate, the helper. There are variant lists of which exact 99 names refer to God. But the doctrine of the oneness of God is very important for Muslims. You might compare this to the Jewish Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. He is one God. So the idea is the same between Judaism and Islam, that God is one. Islam is a monotheistic religion and has been from the very beginning. The opposite of Tawheed, which means unity in Arabic, the doctrine of the oneness of God, the opposite of that is shirk, an Arabic word that is basically equivalent to polytheism, ascribing partners to Allah, such as in traditional Arabic belief before Islam, the idea was that Allah had three daughters, and that is condemned as heretical by Muslims because it says that God has partners. And remember what it said: God is not begotten and has not begotten anyone. Right. So Muslims have a problem with the Christian concept of the Trinity because they believe that by elevating Jesus to divinity, the status of God, and the Holy Spirit also, they believe that this is ascribing partners to God, and so Muslims denounce this particular belief of Christianity as a polytheistic belief. Prophets, as I said last time in the last video, prophets are central to Muslim theology. There are 25 named prophets in the Quran, mostly corresponding to people mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, plus John the Baptist and Jesus. However, there are many other prophets in Islamic tradition that are not named in the Quran. And one tradition says there are 124,000 different prophets. Abraham is particularly important because, according to Muslim tradition, he rejected his father's idolatry and recognized the oneness of God. Now, you may say, I don't know any story in the Bible about Abraham rejecting his father's idolatry, and you're right. There is no such story in the Bible. However, there is an old Jewish tradition. It's preserved in a book called The Apocalypse of Abraham that tells that exact story. So this is obviously a story that was circulating among Jews. Remember, there were Jews and Christians in the Arabian Peninsula, and this is where Muhammad picked up a lot of his knowledge about Judaism and Christianity and about the Bible itself prior to his reception of these revelations from the angel Jibril. Muslims see angels as servants and messengers of God. The jinn, I talked about it last time, or genies, are beings of invisible fire. They may be good, that is, allied with God, or they may be bad. They may help humans, they may harm them. In the Quran, there's a story about a group of jinn who were converted to Islam by hearing the Quran recited. So one of the jinn is given a name, and his name is Iblis. And he's sometimes called Shaitan, which you probably can recognize is equivalent to the word Satan, which comes from a Hebrew word. So Iblis, the devil, or Shaitan, Satan, is a jinn who is identified in Islam as an evil spirit, an evil jinn. And why is he evil? Well, God gave the order for all the spirits, all the angels, all the jinn to bow down to Adam after God had created the first man. And Iblis refused to do it. He had a pretty good reason. He said, well, the reason I refuse to do it is because only God should be worshipped. And this is a creation of God, Adam is. And therefore, I refuse to worship him. However, because he violated the direct command of God, he was thrown out of heaven. However, he was allowed to tempt humans. And so Iblis, or Shaitan, plays a similar role in Islam that he does in Christianity, and to a lesser extent in Judaism. Okay, Muslims also believe that there will be a final judgment on the last day, and this will result in people being sent either to paradise or to the fire, which of course corresponds to hell. So Muslims also believe in a differentiated afterlife, just as Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians do traditionally. Traditionally, men were to be granted the company of 72 virgins. This is according to a good hadith, not a sound hadith, but a good hadith. The Quran talks about virgins being given to men in paradise, but it doesn't specify the number. While women are granted only one husband, you can argue about which one got the better deal. There are two main branches of Islam, and I've mentioned them before. Sunni, those are the ones who supported the community choice of Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, and the Shia, who thought that somebody from Muhammad's own family ought to always be the leader of the community. So Sunnis make up between 87 and 90% of Muslims worldwide today. And I should say there are, I want to say something like 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, so it's the second largest religion after Christianity. All right, so Sunnis make up between 87 and 90% of Muslims, so Shias make up between 10 and 13%. Of countries that have a majority of their citizens that are Muslim, there are only a few Shia majority countries. Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Azerbaijan, so just those four. Lebanon is about evenly divided between Sunnis and Shias. They each make up about 27% of the population, and then Christians make up about 40% of the population of Lebanon. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, but he ruled over a majority Shia country when he was still in power. And on the flip side of that, the current leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is a Shia, an Alawite, a branch of the Shia, but he rules over a majority Sunni country. So that's just that's kind of interesting. The largest Muslim countries by population, you might think, oh, well, it's got to be Saudi Arabia and Egypt and countries like that are mostly Arab. In fact, the largest Muslim country by population is Indonesia, followed by Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Egypt, Iran, and Turkey. And so of the top 8 countries, only one of them is an Arab country, Egypt. It's a common misperception that the majority of Muslim people are Arabs. In fact, only about 20% of Muslims are Arab or of Arab descent. There are Muslims around the world from all sorts of different ethnic groups. Only a relatively small percentage, 20%, are Arabs. Last time I mentioned a man by the name of Muawiyah, who became one of the caliphs. He was the 5th caliph. He was one who succeeded Ali after his death. He was the founder of the Umayyad dynasty in 661, and his dynasty lasted about 90 years. The idea was that the Muslim community was one community. Even as it expanded, it was still just one community, and so there should be a single Muslim ruler. The community was called the Ummah, which just means community. And at first, it was largely the case that there was a single Muslim ruler that was the caliph, who was recognized by the majority of Muslims, by the Sunnis anyways. But eventually, Islam spread so far that there was more than one caliph at a time, even among the Sunnis. So Muawiyah's capital, the capital of the Umayyad dynasty, was in Damascus, in modern-day Syria. Now, after the death of Ali, Muawiyah took over and represented the majority of Muslims, the Sunnis. What happened to the Shia? Well, after the death of Ali, the Shia said, the leader of the community ought to be in Muhammad's family. So they turned to Ali's sons. First Hassan, he led the community, the Shia community, for a while. Then he was killed. And then Hussein, another of Ali's sons, led the community. He led a revolt against not Muawiyah, but against Muawiyah's son now. And Hussein was killed in the Battle of Karbala in Iraq, what is nowadays Iraq. And so, as I said, there were a lot of assassinations. There were a lot of deaths among the leaders of the Muslim community, particularly among the Shia, for the first few centuries. And so, after Hussein's death, the Shia continued to appoint new successors who were called imams, until they got to the 12th imam, Muhammad ibn al-Hassan, who, according to Shia tradition, was hidden. He just disappeared, and the tradition was that he was hidden by God in the year 941. However, he will eventually return as the Mahdi. This is a messianic figure. And spell that, the Mahdi. He will eventually return as the Mahdi and rule over all Muslims around the world. We're going to shift back now to the Sunnis because, like I said, they are the majority group. Let's see. What do I want to say? There was one of Muawiyah's successors was named Abd al-Malik. He strengthened the institution of the state as opposed to the caliph as an individual. And he made Arabic the official language of the Umayyad Empire. He also built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So when you see a picture of Jerusalem today and you see a building with a gold dome on it, that's the Dome of the Rock. It is a Muslim mosque. It's not the oldest Muslim mosque in Jerusalem, but it is a very old mosque. Although the Muslims had spread their influence far and wide, the majority of citizens in their territories at first did not convert to Islam. It took, a couple of centuries for the majority in some of these places outside of Arabia to convert to Islam. As I have said earlier, there were certainly incentives given for people to convert. For example, those who were not Muslims had to pay a jizya. That's an interesting word, because it's just a word that means tax. And so this is a tax on unbelievers. And so that's a little bit of incentive to convert. But the people who were not Muslims, they were allowed self-rule very often. During the Umayyad period, which is the first large caliphate, the Muslims began to develop in all sorts of different ways. Muslim scholars studied the Quran and the Hadith, but they also began to develop Islamic law, which is called fiqh in Arabic, Islamic theology, kalam, and Islamic philosophy, falsafa. They obviously borrowed the Greek word there. In the year 711, so about 100 years after Muhammad first started receiving these visions from the angel Jibreel, in the year 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, I'm just going to put his first name, Tariq, he was a Muslim, and he led a raiding party from Gibraltar across the Mediterranean into the Iberian Peninsula. Originally, he had been invited over there by a rival of the king, the Visigothic king Roderick, who by this time the Goths had converted to Christianity. So the Iberian Peninsula was largely, almost entirely, largely Christian. And so Tariq ibn Ziyad was invited to come over and help this other king, or this rival to the king, fight Roderick. So he did, and he beat him pretty easily. And then he says, "Oh well, as long as we're here, we might as well continue taking territory, as long as it's not too much trouble." And they found the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula to be surprisingly easy. So much so that within 6 years, by the year 717, they had conquered most of the peninsula, and even crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into what is modern-day France. They finally met resistance from Odo, the Duke of Aquitaine, and at the Battle of Toulouse in 721, and from Charles Martel. He was the grandfather of Charlemagne. Charles Martel had the title Mayor of the Palace, but he was the leader of the army, and he defeated Tariq ibn Ziyad and his followers at the Battle of Tours in 732. So he retreated back into the Iberian Peninsula, and the Muslims controlled the Iberian Peninsula from that point for much of the next 700 years, 750 years really. The land was called Al-Andalus, and originally it was part of the Umayyad Caliphate that was based in Damascus, but it was so far away that eventually they got their own caliph, and they were part of the Caliphate of Cordoba. Cordoba is a city in Spain. The only Christian kingdom to survive Tariq's conquest was the small kingdom of Asturias in the far north, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula remained in Muslim control until 1492. We'll talk more about what happened in the Iberian Peninsula in a bit. The Umayyads were succeeded in the year 750 by a different group called the Abbasids, and the Umayyad Empire had only lasted, or the Umayyad Caliphate had only lasted 90 years. The Abbasid Caliphate, in contrast, lasted almost 800 years. And the Abbasids were a different Arab clan who were indirectly tied to Muhammad. They revolted against the Umayyads, overthrew them. One of the characteristics of the Abbasids was that they treated both Arab and non-Arab Muslims equally, which kind of was the idea behind the Ummah, that Islam would be one big community. The Umayyads apparently had favored Arabs, but the Abbasids said, hey, if you're Muslim, you're good. We will treat you equally. And the Abbasids also moved the capital from Damascus in Syria to Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. One of the caliphs, his name was Harun al-Rashid, 796 to 809. You don't need to know the dates. I'm just telling you when he ruled. He established a library called the Bait al-Hikmah, which is Arabic for the House of Wisdom. So it was a library in Baghdad, and the sciences and arts flourished. While Europe was in the middle, well, really towards the beginning of the Middle Ages, and sometimes this period of time is called the Dark Ages in Europe, science and art, philosophy were flourishing in Muslim-controlled parts of the world. And Greek and Syriac philosophical works were translated into Arabic. The works of Aristotle were translated into Arabic. Now keep in mind, Aristotle had written in Greek, and so his works were known in the Byzantine Empire that still spoke Greek. But in the West, where the Germanic tribes had overthrown the Western Roman Empire, and the main language of scholarship was Latin, the works of Aristotle were not translated, or very few had been translated into Latin, and so his works were largely forgotten for centuries. But they were known and discussed in the Muslim-speaking parts of the world. In the 9th and the 10th centuries, independent caliphates and sultanates arose. A sultan is one level down from a caliph, right? And these other caliphs and other sultans would give lip service to the Abbasids in Baghdad, but basically they operated on their own and did whatever they wanted. One example of this is the Fatimids. The Fatimids in Egypt were a Shia group that ruled for a couple of hundred years. Now, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the Crusades. In 1099, an army of Western Christians captured Jerusalem during the First Crusade, and they held the city for about 90 years. They also established other Crusader states in the east, in Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. So about 90 years later, in the year 1187, Jerusalem was recaptured by the Muslims by a man by the name of Saladin. And Saladin was actually a very well-respected ruler. He was well-respected not only by Muslims, but by Christians as well. In fact, some of the medieval literature about Saladin, much of which was written long after his death, but he developed an almost mythical attraction for many Christian writers who described him as the essence of chivalry and a leader who was better in many ways than some of the Christian leaders among whom they lived. So Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, and he ruled over Egypt. Originally, he was the Fatimid dynasty was allied with the Shias, but under Saladin, they changed their alliance to the Sunnis. And when Christian armies marched to the east during the Crusades, they encountered a culture that was much more advanced than theirs was. in art, science, philosophy, and so forth. And this encounter with the Eastern world of the Byzantine Empire, and especially with the Muslim world, led to a minor renaissance. It's called the Renaissance of the 12th century, and then ultimately led a couple of hundred years later to the Florentine Renaissance of the 14th century. Muslims were eventually driven out of Al-Andalus, that is the Iberian Peninsula. It took 700 years, but the Christians in the north slowly pushed back over the centuries. This is called the Reconquista, the reconquest. And Muslims were eventually kicked out of Spain and Portugal. The last Muslim stronghold was overthrown in 1492. That was Granada. And Muslims also had controlled Sicily, right next to Italy. They were eventually kicked out of Sicily as well. But Muslims retained a foothold in Eastern Europe. And meanwhile, they expanded further south in Africa and down the east coast of Africa. And in Asia, they expanded to the north and to the east. So Islam was pushed back a little bit in parts of Europe, but they were still expanding in many other parts of the world.